All right, let's continue on with Unit 9. What does it mean to be a citizen in a global society? Today, we're going to be focusing on main ideas and key details as we read Going Out, which is an excerpt from Factory Girls from Village to City in a Changing China. Before we read, we're going to take a look at the video that's going to help us make connections and understand the text better in relation to all the conditions of factories in China. We'll be able to see their work environment so that we can make a better connection to the text we're going to be reading and the girls we're going to be reading about. Let's go ahead and watch that video together. Give it a second to load while you prepare page 22 in your Unit 9 book.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about us. Subject to think you're right. But
on the labor-intensive production lines of Guangdong province, where some 30% of China's exports are made, women have traditionally far outnumbered men. They are hired for their supposed docility, nimble fingers, and attention to detail. But in recent years, the supply of cheap, unskilled labor has begun to dry up, despite high demand from factory bosses. As women have become better educated and more aware of their rights, the stereotype of female passivity is beginning to crumble. Over the past 3 decades, the migration of tens of millions of women from the countryside to factories in Guangdong and other coastal provinces has helped to transform the world view of an especially downtrodden sector of Chinese society. Conditions in the factories have often been harsh. Poor safety, illegally long working hours, cramped accommodation, few breaks, and little leave. But for many, it has also been liberating and empowering. Women are still not as well educated as men, with about a year less in school on average. But the gap has been narrowing. Crucially, China's changing demographics have been shifting in their favor. Labor shortages that began to hit low-skilled manufacturing in the second half of the last decade have driven up wages and forced factories to improve working conditions. Strikes have become increasingly common, where women appear as likely to take part as men. Strikes in 2010, affecting plants in Guangdong owned by Honda, a Japanese car firm, helped to galvanize labor activism. One of them occurred at a plant in the city of Zhongshan, where the workers were mostly female. The unrest there resulted in pay concessions and set a precedent for collective bargaining. Representatives chosen by the workers themselves led negotiations, rather than government-controlled trade unions. In the coming years, Guangdong's industrial transformation is likely to even out the sex ratio in some of its towns and cities, where it has been skewed towards women. The city of Dongguan is known for having many more women than men, but by 2010, it had a male majority. Some factories have become so desperate for cheap labor that they're allowing men to work on production lines exclusively reserved for women. But this does not mean China's factory women are giving up and going home. Many of them are in their 30s or 40s and have been working in factories for the last 20 years. They are typical of their generation of migrants. They have become urban, and their children know nothing else. Having left behind their agricultural past for an industrial future, they are unlikely to turn back now.
All right, that video is a perfect connection to our text. So we're going to go ahead and exit here and go back to our reading. Let's start with this introductory piece. Throughout history and around the world, people have migrated great distances in search of economic opportunity. Whether the movement is from one continent to another or within one's own country, many people must make major life choices in order to have access to jobs and resources. Today, China has around 130 million migrant workers who are at the heart of the country's economic boom. These workers have moved from the Chinese countryside to the city centers, where they work in factories. In Factory Girls, journalist Leslie Ching paints a vivid picture of these migrant workers by following the lives of two young working women. In this excerpt, the reader is introduced to Lu Qingmin as she confronts the realities of being a factory girl in Dongguan, China. To go out, or chugu, is the term Chinese migrants use when they leave home to find work. As I read paragraphs 1 and 2, you guys are going to go ahead and find two more key details that support the main idea. So the main idea here is Min disliked the place where she worked and was unaware of the poor living conditions before she accepted the job. Take a second to jot that down in your book before we move on. And since the main idea says that she disliked where she worked, I definitely want to find key details that support dislike. And then I also want to find key details that support the poor living conditions, because she wasn't taking on a tour of the job prior to accepting it. So there's some unknowns here. Find two more key details on top of the one I underlined for you already. For a long time, Lu Qingmin was alone. Her older sister worked at a factory in Shenzhen, a booming industrial city an hour away by bus. Her friends from home were scattered at factories up and down China's coast, but Min, as her friends called her, was not in touch with them. It was a matter of pride. Because she didn't like the place she was working, she didn't tell anyone where she was. She simply dropped out of sight. Her factory's name was Karen Electronics. The Hong Kong-owned company made alarm clocks, calculators, and electronic calendars that displayed the time of day in cities around the world. The factory had looked respectable when Min came for an interview in March 2003. Tile buildings, a cement yard, a metal accordion gate that folded shut. It wasn't until she was hired that she was allowed inside. Workers slept 12 to a room in bunks crowded near the toilets. The rooms were dirty and they smelled bad. The food in the canteen was bad too. A meal consisted of rice, one side or meat, a vegetable, and a soup that was watery. So another key detail you may have found is that because she didn't like the place she was working, she didn't tell anyone where she was. That definitely shows us that she disliked where she worked. And as far as the poor living conditions, hopefully you selected that workers slept 12 to a room in bunks that would crowd near the bathrooms. The rooms were dirty, they smelled bad. The food was bad too, truly bad conditions. Let's turn the page. And as I read this, I'm going to be giving key details that you're going to underline. And your goal is going to be to find, based on the key details, which end to the main idea is best. You're going to find a couple of options in your Google document, that's your homework. You're going to decide what key details are supporting which of the best main ideas. So I'll start the main idea for you. Min was unprepared for life at a factory, and she was very unhappy with the working conditions and long hours. Your goal is to finish that main idea based on what we read here. And you'll finish that with the multiple choice option that's listed in your assignment. A day on the assembly line stretched from 8 in the morning until midnight, 13 hours on the job plus 2 breaks for meals, and workers labored every day for weeks on end. Sometimes on a Saturday afternoon, they had no overtime, which was their only break. The workers made 400 yuan a month. That's the equivalent of $50, and close to double that with no overtime. But the pay was often late. The factory employed 1,000 people, mostly women, either teenagers just out from home or married women already past 30. You could judge the quality of the workplace by who was missing. Young women in their 20s, the elite of the factory world. When Min imagined sitting on the assembly line every day for the next 10 years, she was filled with dread. She was 16 years old. From the moment she entered the factory, she wanted to leave, but she pledged to stick it out for 6 months. It would be good to toughen herself up, and her options were limited for now. The legal working age was 18, though 16 and 17-year-olds could work certain jobs for certain hours or shorter hours. Generally, only an employer that freely broke the law, the very blackest factories men called them, would hire someone as young as she was. Her first week on the job, Min turned 17. She took a half day off and walked the streets alone, buying some sweets and eating them by herself. She had no idea what people did for fun. Before she had come to the city, she had only a vague notion of what a factory was. Dimly, she imagined it as a lively social gathering. I thought it would be fun to work on the assembly line, she later said. I thought it would be a lot of people working together, busy, talking, and having fun. I thought it would be very free, but it was not that way at all. So, some key details that are important to this section are the fact that from the moment she entered the factory, she wanted to leap. Also, the legal working age was 18, though 16 and 17-year-olds could work, right, in the blackest of factories. And then also, before she had come to the city, she had only a vague notion of what a factory was. Dimly, she imagined it as a lively social gathering. Your job is to complete the main idea based on these key details with all of the options that are provided for you in the Google Doc. You can do that now or continue reading and go back to it. Don't forget also that she was 16 years old at this time. That should also be something we highlight. All right, to finish up, I'm going to read paragraph 6. Your goal is to annotate key details that are important, right? We're going to do that together, and then you're going to write a main idea for us. That main idea has to be more than 10 words, right? We want to keep main ideas short and sweet and to the point, but not to the sense that we just write a statement that doesn't really have a lot of foundation. So you have to be very selective with the words you choose. Talking on the job was forbidden, and it carried a 5 yuan fine. Bathroom breaks were limited to 10 minutes and required a sign-up list. Min worked in quality control and checking the electronic gadgets as they moved past on the assembly line to make sure buttons worked and plastic pieces joined and batteries hooked up as they should. She was not a model worker. She chattered constantly and sang with the other women on the line. Sitting still made her feel trapped, like a bird in a cage, so she frequently ran to the bathroom just to look out the window at the green mountains that reminded her of home. Dongwon was a factory city set in the lush subtropics, and sometimes it seemed that Min was the only one who noticed. Because of her, the factory passed a rule that limited workers to one bathroom break every 4 hours. The penalty for violators was 5 yuan. So in this section, these 3 details are super important. Talking on the job was forbidden and carried a 5 yuan fine. She was not a model worker. She chatted constantly. And because of her, the factory passed a rule that limited workers to one bathroom break every 4 hours. You're going to use these key details to create your own main idea. Think about not the conditions in this case, right? But the quality of life that she had and what kind of worker she was and the consequences for her as a worker. Okay? When you finish that up, go ahead and submit your assignment.